Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be back. I've got the last bit of the morning warming up for the awards for you. So it's a brief review of the results of the 2012 members survey, so the year before Professor Bradley's survey that you just heard about. So last week I stepped back in time. I went to visit a house where in the 18th century in Geneva, a man called Charles Lulin had lived. Now, Charles Lulin in 1758 was 89. He'd been suffering from failing vision over the 10 years before that, and we don't know the cause of his visual loss, but we suspect it might have been age-related macular degeneration. And he had been a magistrate in Geneva, and in 1758 he developed visual hallucinations for which he kept a very detailed diary. Now the house still stands. It's in an old part of the city, which is, I imagine, exactly as it was in 1758. And with his diary in hand, I was able to stand there and relive his hallucination experiences. So I was able to stand in the road and look down towards the end where there's a fountain, still standing today, which is a central column with a single spout of water coming from it. But Lulin described seeing it expanding, developing a globe on top, lots of water spouts, and a procession of men in grey suits walking out of the fountain. Behind the fountain there's a house, and Lulin described the house as covered in scaffolding with a large crane on top of it. I was able to look at the views that he described as covered in tiny dots, atomic particles whirling all around. And I was able to walk to the neighbouring house where he'd seen a carriage draw up and grow to the proportion of the house. So I had a real sense of how big that carriage must have seemed to him. Charles Lulin's grandson was Charles Bonnet. And Charles Bonnet took the excerpts from this diary and included them in an essay that he wrote, a philosophical essay. And in honour of that description, we now refer to the association of eye disease and visual hallucinations as the Charles Bonnet Syndrome. Now, Lulin's diary left us with two important legacies. The first was that Lulin only had hallucinations for about 8 months, from February 1758 to September 1758. So it was a transient phenomenon that went away. The second legacy was the fact that Lulin very much enjoyed his visual hallucinations. So Bonnet described how Lulin would be sitting in his drawing room with guests in front of him, talking about his favourite subject, which was local politics. And he'd interrupt the flow of conversation and point to the wall to the side or an empty space beside him and describe in intricate detail the tapestries that were there, the costumes of the figures. Bonnet referred to the Lulin's descriptions, or the Lulin's hallucinations, as playthings of his brain, giving you a sense of how much he enjoyed it. So these two ideas have sort of become enshrined in clinical tradition, the idea that Charles Bonnet Syndrome gets better and that people enjoy it. And that was until the 2012 Macular Society Members Survey. So the members survey that we sent out was 4,000 questionnaires, postal questionnaires, and of those we received about 500 people in the society who have Charles Bonnet Syndrome. Now that's the largest number ever collected, and it allows us to say entirely new things about Charles Bonnet Syndrome, and two important consequences have arisen from it. So the first relates to this idea that Charles Bonnet Syndrome gets better. Of the members with Charles Bonnet Syndrome, about 75% had had Charles Bonnet Syndrome hallucinations for more than 5 years. Now, that's not to say that they had it at the same intensity for all that time, or that they were as troubling for all that time. But it does mean to say that the advice that we've been telling you for many years now, that your hallucinations will get better within 18 months and there's no need to worry, that probably isn't true. And unfortunately, if you have Charles Bonnet syndrome, the chances are that you may continue to have the occasional hallucination, at least for many years to come. Now, the second new contribution of the survey relates to this idea that they're pleasant and pleasurable. Only 7% of members were like Lulin and actually enjoyed their hallucinations. About 30% found the hallucinations disturbing, troubling, and distressing, and overall, the experience was a very negative one. So we've coined this new term, negative outcome Charles Bonnet syndrome, to describe this particular subgroup. And because we've got so many people in this subgroup, we can say a little bit more about the factors that lead to it. So the first is to do with the hallucinations themselves. So if you have hallucinations that are continuous or there for most of the day, you're more likely to have negative outcome Charles Bonnet syndrome than someone who only has them for a few seconds or minutes. If you have hallucinations that are occurring every day, as opposed to maybe once a week or once a month, again, you're more likely to have negative outcome Charles Bonnet syndrome. If the hallucinations have a strong emotional element to them, so if you find the image that you're seeing very distressing, then that is going to increase your chances of having negative outcome Charles Bonnet syndrome. And if it interferes with your day-to-day activities, so for example, stopping you watching television, stopping you getting around and about, interfering with you going to sleep, then this is more likely to give you a negative outcome. Now, unfortunately, as many of you will know, we don't yet have a cure for Charles Bonnet syndrome. So there's not very much we can do to stop these particular factors causing negative outcome. What we can do is help you maybe stop a hallucination in its tracks. So through eye movements, through changing lighting conditions, through getting up and distracting yourself and doing something else, you might be able to stop a hallucination, but you can't cure the hallucinations entirely. But there was another aspect of the survey that reveals one way of helping people that we can do now. And this relates to the finding that an important factor in increasing your chances of getting negative outcome Charles Bonnet syndrome is not knowing about the possibility of Charles Bonnet syndrome when you have your first hallucination. So 70% of the members that replied with Charles Bonnet syndrome knew nothing about Charles Bonnet syndrome when they first had their hallucination. And naturally, they will have assumed that they had an early onset of a serious mental illness or perhaps early dementia, not realizing that this, in fact, was the normal response of the brain to visual loss. So this, of course, is something that's relatively easy to treat. We just need to inform people. We need to make sure that everyone who's at risk of getting Charles Bonnet syndrome knows about it at the time they have their first hallucination. And, of course, the Macular Society has been championing this for many years and raising awareness about it. And in my final words, I just wanted to say something about how successful you've been. So our paper was published, or the Macular Society survey was written up as a paper for the British Journal of Ophthalmology and published in May of this year. Now, one of the metrics of impact these days is about how much a paper gets media attention on social media, so that means blogs, Twitter and Facebook, for those of you that are of a certain age and recognize what that means. And by these metrics, our humble Macular Society survey is in the top 10 papers ever published in the British Journal of Ophthalmology. So congratulations to the Society, and thank you for helping raise awareness of Charles Bonnet syndrome, and thank you to yourselves for your attention.